Hey folks, this is Craig. Before we get into today's conversation, we want to take a moment to tell you about the Acid Horizon Research Commons Summer School. The full lineup is now live and it is stacked. Running May through September, we have 6 courses with 6 incredible instructors covering everything from anarchic origins in science and art with Timothy Jackson, to Fanon's dialectical philosophy with Tyreek MacGeorge, to Emma Stam's course on anti-civilization and recovering from industry and progress. Plus 3 others that are equally essential. If you've been looking for a structured way to go deeper into the ideas we discuss on this show, this is it. Head to acidhorizonpodcast.com/AHRC-courses to browse the full lineup. And if you are already a Patreon supporter, your exclusive discount code is waiting for you with your subscription. But move fast because all of that expires on May 13th. Now, speaking of going deeper, today's episode is about 2 writers who dedicated their lives to diagnosing exactly what was wrong with mass culture and our mediums of connection, and whether there's any way out. We are joined by Hannah Smart, fiction writer, critic, and author of the debut novel Meat Puppets, for a conversation about David Foster Wallace, Mark Fischer, sincerity, irony, and what it means to live in a world rigged against those trying to be real within it. Okay, let's listen. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Today, we're diving into a conversation that feels urgently of the moment, the resurgence of David Foster Wallace, whose diagnoses of irony, inertia, and the hollowness of performance seem to get sharper with every passing year rather than duller. One of the things that we want to think through today is a particular tension that's emerged around Wallace's legacy. The figure of the performative male, the guy carrying infinite jest as a signal of intellectual tastes, and perhaps as a kind of social armor, set against the very thing Wallace was calling for, which was the opposite of performance in some way. And while the meme has a gendered element, the tendency itself may not. The performance of one's aesthetic, intellectual, emotional, and lifestyle stylings as a kind of identity currency is something any of us can fall into, and most of us probably have in some way or another. Now, the new sincerity, the willingness to be earnest, vulnerable, even embarrassingly naive in a culture that rewards ironic detachment above almost everything else. 30 years after E Unibus Plurim, we want to ask, did that literary generation of anti-rebels actually ever arrive? Is true sincerity even possible in a world where social capital is so firmly rooted in the curation of one's own stylings, online and in the third dimension? Or have our judgments been fatally determined by a deathless cynicism no longer capable of recognizing what's real amidst the images we curate of ourselves and our world? Wallace saw all of this coming. The question is whether anyone found a way out. And to help us think through all of this, we have a fantastic guest joining us today. Hannah Smart is a fiction writer and critic whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Boston Globe, West Branch, and Smoke Long Quarterly, among others. She's a 2-time Pushcart nominee, founder of the experimental journal The Militant Grammarian, and her debut novel, Meat Puppets, is out now from Apocalypse Confidential Press. And also joining us are Adam from the Acid Horizon podcast here and Emma from Left Hand. So, Hannah, I just want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Well, could you just begin by rounding out your biography and your relationship to the work of David Foster Wallace? What was it in particular about Wallace's work that attracted you, and how has his work shaped the way that you write?
Yeah, so I first read Wallace in college in 2018. I picked up Infinite Jest, and it was one of those moments where I was just like instantly captivated. I think that the way that he writes, the sort of stream of consciousness that he inhabits felt so similar to my own that I just kind of, after that point, I realized I would have to read everything he wrote, which I did within like a 6-month period. And my grades started slipping as a result because I was reading David Foster Wallace instead of the assigned readings for my classes. And then I had to read them again. And I found like Infinite Jest, for example, is a completely different book the second time you read it. And I would even say the third time you read it. I've read it 9 times at this point, so it's starting to be more similar with every reading. But it takes a few times. Like there's so much subtext that is like not apparent until you have the context of the whole book. There are characters that are introduced late in the book who are important early in the book, so you sort of skim past them because you don't know who they are, and then when you reread it you're like, oh, it's that person, I know how they're important now. And so stuff like that just sort of compels rereading. And yeah, I mean, his essays I think are also great. I think E Unibus Plurum in particular is sort of often considered to be his manifesto, and Infinite Jest is considered to be sort of his fictional attempt to do what he said would be the next big thing, which is the new sincerity in E Unibus Plurum, using sort of the irony of his predecessors to push past into something that's real, to replace the values that the postmodernists had demolished. And I recently, you mentioned my essay that was published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. That was an analysis of his short story, Mr. Squishy, particularly one 900-word sentence, which I attempted to sentence diagram. And I kind of analyzed like the physical attributes of the diagram to show how it's a story about nothing ever happening and how it keeps promising this potential resolution and then denying that resolution. And I kind of talked about how that's very apt in our current information age, where we've got so much that seems to be promising to be happening because we have access to so much information, and yet we have still this feeling of stagnancy or even nihilism. Wallace, he was a very talented novelist. I think he was maybe even more talented as a short story writer, and his collection Oblivion is probably my favorite to reread because there's so much to be gotten out of it. He killed himself in 2008, so there have been a lot of developments since then. And he actually, the last few published writings of his were talking about the Bush administration and how he felt like the Bush administration was a harbinger of something really terrible. And well, we found out what that is. So yeah, I think he was really prescient. And yeah, my bio, you got most of it. I'm also, my book Meat Puppets will be out May 5th. It's available for pre-order. And I'm also editing a collaborative leftist zine called Emergency, about the emergency we all find ourselves in. So that will be out June 4th.
Cool. Well, we'll have to get links for all of that stuff and put it in the show notes. I just have one more question before we bring Adam and Emma into the fray. I know, at least for Adam, I think this was his first pass at David Foster Wallace, and maybe Emma hadn't read him in quite a while. But I think one thing that we need to tackle right from the get-go is the relationship between David Foster Wallace and the concept of postmodernism, a hotly contested term, and a term for which everybody has their own definition. Although we could say in the case of David Foster Wallace, his idea of postmodernism was well-informed and quite rigorous. Maybe you could help us through that.
Yeah, he was asked in an interview once, what is postmodernism? And he said, after modernism. And then he refused to elaborate on it because I think is just such a contentious idea. But in E Unibus Plurum, he does sort of mention a few of what he considers to be the weaknesses of postmodernism, in scare quotes, which are sort of the tendencies to satirize everything. Originally, it arose out of a desire to debunk the grand narratives of modernism in the post-war era. modernism began to feel kind of quaint. And so it was all about these grand narratives, and postmodernism was all about fragmentation, and there are no grand narratives, and everything is dumb and pointless. And that did a very good job of debunking modernism. But I think Wallace's problem with it was you've burned down the house. What are you gonna put there in its place? Sort of deal. You can't keep burning, just keep lighting the rubble on fire forever. You've got to at some point instantiate positive values. But because everything's so ironic and so tongue-in-cheek and self-referential now, anyone who tries to instantiate positive values will instantly be subject to the very same postmodern irony that they are criticizing. So it's sort of a tricky situation that writers found themselves in.
I understood more of this essay than I expected to through the fact that I have watched every episode of MASH about 500 times. So I felt surprisingly decently equipped for this. I mean, I quite enjoyed its critique, or at least its analysis of television. For example, the idea that writers tend to be almost voyeuristic in how they approach everyday situations, sort of mining them from their own gaze to establish ideas for characters, ideas for situations, ideas for affects and feelings. But with TV, it's kind of hard to do that because everyone there knows they're being watched on the basis that they are actors and therefore are trained to act as if they are not being watched. And it's kind of a bit of an inversion in a way of the kind of the meme of the performative male, which I don't think puts too much emphasis on either on the notion of performativity. I think it's mostly in a way a kind of bad acting idea that someone is acting as if they want to be seen, but they don't present themselves with the kind of TV actor mode of presentation in which they act as if no one is looking, even though you definitionally know that they are being watched. And I wondered how it would factor into ideas like the parasocial, and people relate to quote unquote content creators who also know they're being watched, but there is a more direct feedback process. So I also wondered how his analysis of TV would hold up in relation to like reality TV. Because at one point he talks about how TV addresses us as individuals on the base, even though everyone watching a TV is part of the biggest crowd in human history. And how TV responds to this problem is to generate irony in the sense that one is part of the crowd of watchers, but one sees oneself as transcending it because you're not fully invested in it because you're doing so ironically. And it's always been a classical sort of dialectical double bind. And I just wondered how much this works in terms of how certain shifts in reality TV carried on in the early 2000s, early to today, really. For example, mass voting, like sort of democratization of reality TV with like X Factor in the UK or something, or America's Got Talent, where there was a mass democratic participation there where you are put into the mass. And I just wondered what he was reading at the time, to be honest. I mean, a lot of this stuff about TV seems like it wouldn't go amiss in, for example, Louis Althusser's account of ideological state apparatuses. You know, this is why the best postmodernists, I'm not counting Althusser as postmodernists, but the best postmodernists are usually good communists. But no, I just thought it'd be interesting to think about it in terms of contemporary forms of media consumption. Because and I think, Hannah, what you're saying about postmodernists, this idea of the people burning down these modernist traditions, I think, yeah, when he talks about some of the examples of that, particularly, for example, William S. Burroughs, he almost talks as if the idea that these guys had was to expose the hypocrisy at the basis of all of our sort of grand modern values. And then, as we know today, if you point out the hypocrisy of a dominant system of values, it's not exactly, it's trite. It doesn't necessarily bring you to a positive moment of transcending that. I mean, we can point at the American or any political class in the world today and tell them that they're hypocrites, but that also tends to be part of the selling point, actually. It's never necessarily detrimental to their overall project.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say about reality TV is really interesting, particularly because I think that he kind of did predict reality TV in a way, and in that essay, I think a lot of what he talks about, I mean, I teach this essay to my students, and And a lot of times they're like, well, like, this is so outdated. Like, I don't watch TV 6 hours a day, And I was like, is there anything else that you do 6 hours a day to fill your time that's sort of mindless and unenriching? And they're all like, oh yeah, like I scroll TikTok or whatever. And it's like, well, there you go. Like there's always something. Like he's criticizing a type of tendency more than necessarily, then it was TV, but now it's social media, and everything is getting even more short form and more ironic. I think we could talk later about examples of media that I think sort of went in the direction that Wallace predicted, but I feel like a lot of it has almost gone in the opposite direction and gotten more postmodern or post-ironic, where you're ironizing the irony that's ironizing the irony or whatever,
Hannah, your response teed me up for what I was already thinking about. We're all storytellers today. If not fiction writers, we're all narrativists, because our extremely online condition forces us to invest greater consciousness both in ourselves and our own stories and the stories of others as they're telling them. So we're putting more attention on ourselves than ever before, if I may speak in sweeping terms with a bunch of caveats, but generally. And the way that we're interacting with other people has shifted towards account of them that isn't quote unquote natural or spontaneous, but heavily thought through. And as I think about the deadlock between modernism and postmodernism and Wallace's project, if he's of particular relevance now, especially in the post-COVID super online era, I think it's because the way I see it, we need to look to people who are grappling with issues of irony and meaning, because we actually have something like a surplus of meaning. Every element of people's lives, what you eat for breakfast. For me, every time I walk around New York City where I live, every 3 minutes, I see something that I could take a picture of and upload because it's meaningful in some way. It's a semiotic nightmare living here if you want to have any sort of public image online, because I'm never at a loss for things that I can make meaning out of and get social currency through on the internet. So I have to hold myself back from that. Or any thought that I have, I can be an entrepreneur of every single thought in my head. And you don't have to live in a city like New York to experience life this way and to get strong hits of meaning from the people that you follow. So if life, like a film and also like a truly literary novel, has both an A role, the main plot, and a B role, which is just the stuff that you do when you're putzing around your apartment or fucking around with your friends, it's like everything has now shifted to the A role. There's no B role anymore. And I just wonder, the point of a truly literary fiction writer is to show that the B role matters just as much as the A role. And Wallace, I think, had philosophical motivations, but ultimately still landed on the side of the literary, where not everything was about making some philosophical point. And I just kind of wonder if E Unibus Plurim was something of his philosophical manifesto, or a kind of manifesto, do you think that he's trying to bear out this thesis, this conviction that he has in everything that he does as a fiction writer? Or is he meaningfully departing from that and just sort of letting a non-philosophical, non-meaning infused B-roll into his literature that doesn't resolve to this project?
A great question. I think yes and no. I think that he always struggled with trying to bear out that thesis in his own work, I think, because he was so self-conscious and his work is so self-conscious that when you in order to be truly sincere, I feel like you need to be vulnerable. And I think he sometimes struggled with that and felt the need to sort of predict every possible criticism that anyone could have of him. Like, he'd be sincere and then he'd be like, now, of course, you're going to say that this is sappy bullshit or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, now we're back to the self-ironizing. I think we see that particularly in Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. There are a lot of stories that I feel like don't quite reach that sort of sincerity that he was going for. But I think beyond that, in Oblivion, he really does, particularly the story Good Old Neon, which starts out as this sort of attempt to, like, the self-consciousness, hyper self-consciousness, and then it just sort of progresses into something that is very vulnerable and real. And I'm not going to spoil it, but you guys should all read it to see what I'm talking about. I think Mr. Squishy kind of hits on what you were talking about with the A roll and the B roll. Everything is given equal preference. There's a guy climbing a building with possibly a gun, and that's given just as much weight as the color of the socks of the people in the focus group. And it's just like, it's like this stream of just like every conceivable bit of information that is being given to you, or that you could potentially glean from a scene. And it's up to you to decide what's important and what's not. And sometimes what seems like it's important is not, and vice versa. And so it's definitely a story you have to read multiple times to start really parsing through, the information. I think that was really prescient in a way, because I think if our modern life can really be defined as anything, it's surplus information. We have too much information. A lot of it is fake. It's very easy to become misinformed, because how are you supposed to know what the true account is? I have relatives who watch Fox News and think that Fox News is just unbiased reporting of what is going on in the world. And it's like, if you think that, I can imagine becoming really radicalized. Like, if that were what's happening. But it's just so hard to be an informed citizen. And that's something that David Foster Wallace actually talked about he had this essay, Deciderization 2007, which was his intro to the best American essays. That's one of the last things he wrote. But it was just sort of talking about how it's just so difficult to be an informed citizen, and it's only going to get worse as the quantity of information we have access to increases.
Hannah, I wanted to guide the conversation in the direction of what we might call the remediation or the therapy of irony. I actually had an interesting encounter with the work of David Foster Wallace early on while he was alive. And I have a very fuzzy recollection of having seen him at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco way back in the day. And for listeners, Hannah's mouth is agape right now. She's totally fangirling my near contact with David Foster Wallace. But I think more importantly than going to the Palace of Fine Arts was the literary and cultural milieu that was building up in my experience, in the early aughts and then into the earlier part of the 2010s, although David Foster Wallace had already passed away by 2008. But as I mentioned, it was around this time, and I was writing poetry and short stories in a very sort of dilettante-esque sort of way. So I was bouncing around the fringe of this literary phenomenon that was emergent within San Francisco at the time. And one of the things that I was able to see the nascent origins of was the whole live storytelling phenomenon. And I connect that in my mind and my experience to like the McSweeney's literary phenomenon. And McSweeney's I think they published Mr. Squishy, if I'm not mistaken, back in the year 2000 or thereabouts. And so my friends at that time, they were much more into this scene than I was. But it was interesting to see the whole phenomenon of public storytelling as a way to initially remedy or offset the excesses of ironic culture, because what it involved was people getting up on stage telling very vulnerable stories about their youth. Some were comedic, some were tragic, some were a mix of both. That then produced, I would say, a form of comedy too, that when we think of like the comedian Mike Birbiglia, for example, I tend to see him as an offshoot of that because I saw him in San Francisco way back in the day too, before he became famous. And maybe even to a lesser extent, the disgraced Louis C.K. This kind of vulnerable male personality seems to fall out of this tradition somewhat. But the irony, once again, is now with the absolute proliferation of storytelling culture, I'm thinking of The Moth in particular, which you could hear on This American Life. Initially, that was one of the ways that people could get into this. And then the more niche versions like Risk, for example, which is like a kind of queer-oriented storytelling podcast series. But then it seemed over time that this format got standardized in a way and then entered this performative element where people would just try to outdo each other with the stories that they told. And then it seemed to repeat sort of very familiar, urban, young, just out of college, people moving from the Midwest to the cities, all more or less having the same stories, very homogenous, at the level of race and social class as well. And to me, it seemed to fly in the face of what David Foster Wallace envisioned as a literary tradition that would help us overcome irony. I only mention this because I had a hands-on experience with this, but it connects to the broader question of, like, in your own writing and in your own view of this, have you seen what you consider like genuine or authentic attempts at overcoming the excesses of irony? And have you seen, in the same way that I have, those attempts falling back into the trap?
Yeah, so definitely I've seen, I try to write stuff that overcomes irony. I'm not going to make a call on whether I succeed or not, because that's really not my call to make, but that is a big goal of a lot of what I write. I think that the difference between self-awareness and irony is such a thin line, but like I kind of think of it as you want to be self-aware. And if you can be self-aware without being ironic, like that's really the sweet part, because the sweet spot, I mean, because if you're not self-aware, I think that your choices are going to feel less deliberate, but if you push too far into the self-awareness, you start being self-deprecating or self-referential, and that's kind of where you fall back into the pitfalls of irony. So it's very evident why that happens, because with vulnerability comes the desire to want people to know you're self-aware, because if they think you're not self-aware, you're opening yourself up to criticism, to jeering. But once you move into the realm of self-awareness, it's so hard to find the thin line where it's not ironic. And so it makes sense. I think any tradition, literary or otherwise, just by nature of what humanity is like, is going to end up standardized. Literary fiction used to be this really subversive genre that I think the whole point of it was that it doesn't buy into any of the genre tropes, and it's surprising, and it subverts your expectations. But I think over time, literary fiction has become kind of a genre in and of itself. They talk about the MFA fiction, where there are jokes like it's about a professor who's trying to sleep with his student, and because his marriage is failing, and then he kills himself at the end. Like that's kind of the formula of the. And there are others. Someone loses their job and has an affair. Someone gets a divorce and sleeps with their student. Someone loses their professor job and gets a divorce. There are all these different permutations of it, but at the end of the day, it's these same themes that keep coming up, and it's like, why is that? Well, it's because people are reading stuff with these themes, and they're writing what they know, and because they don't know much beyond what they've read, like Wallace talked about, they're not writing from experience. They're writing from their experience of reading other people, writing from their experience of reading other people, writing from their experience. And it's kind of the same issue he identified with TV, where it's like people's idea of real life is now informed by TV rather than real life. And so what does that create? It creates this meta level of like, we're no longer trying to make our art speak to real life. We're trying to make these nods toward common cultural touchstones.
Makes total sense. And then you have the kind of literary prion virus that's cultivated inside these insular circles.
There's no perfect heuristic for distinguishing between irony and self-awareness. And what I've found living in different places and at different points in my life is that that sweet spot really is different in every context. So I moved to Brooklyn for the first time in the early 2010s. And I think that I caught a wave of twee, new Sincerity. This was at the height of the Moth era and a sort of wide-eyed, starry-eyed freak folk, animal collective, pre-Trump for sure, very pre-Trump. Later on went to live in Southern Appalachia and also in Germany. And the ways that you can express self-awareness, sincerity, solemnity, or levity are so different in terms of what they will give you in terms of social capital and the ability to convince other people that you are fluent with the semiotics, the culture, a good reader of yourself and other people, etc. Wallace has been framed, and he was presenting himself as both no less subject to these vagaries and also at the same time above them, because he was writing about them and transmitting them for other people. And you repeatedly referred to him as prescient. What do you think people who might not be familiar with Wallace or only know him through his memification and the discourse around him online, what would you want to tell them about how we might look to his approach as a way to understand how we are to make sense of these obligations to different social contexts and to expressing ourselves in different ways? How might he help people understand that in 2026?
Yeah, you make a lot of really, really great points. And I think that the thing that I like to tell people about Wallace is that I feel like isn't really addressed through the memification is that he's very much a writer of late capitalism. He didn't self-identify as a Marxist, but I think his stuff reads very well through a Marxist lens because it's all about excess and it's all about how overwhelming everything is and how, we're constantly being advertised to, we're constantly being told all these different contradictory ideas for how to live and how to be a person. We're going to our jobs that are meaningless and making us feel meaningless. And I think what his work essentially addresses is how do we find meaning as individuals? And maybe that's where it kind of diverges from the Marxist, because I think it is very individualistic, but at the same time, it really has helped me make sense of the cultural moment that I think was very much happening when he was alive and is still happening. And it's just this sense of excess and this craving for instant gratification, because that's what we've been primed to want by the companies that are advertising to us, by our 9-to-5s that are very boring, and you want to get home and you just want something easy and good. And I think that he kind of believed that that easy entertainment was essentially, in the long term, making us empty. And so he wanted to create entertainment that was both fun and challenging and rewarding, or not both, because that's three things, but fun, challenging, and rewarding. And I think his stuff really, really does do that. And it makes you feel accomplished when you're reading it, even though you're essentially consuming entertainment. And so I think he does have a reputation for being very difficult, but I think it's deliberate. And I think his last book that was published posthumously and is incomplete, The Pale King, is all about boredom and how do we as a culture reacclimate ourselves to boredom, because we've become so allergic to it. When my grandpa was alive, sometimes we'd play cards, and when like my mom was in the kitchen doing something, we had to wait for her to come back to the room and get her cards so we could start the round. Something I noticed over time is that I would like take out my phone and start scrolling, because it's like, oh, I have 3 minutes that I don't have anything to do, better check Facebook or whatever. But my grandpa, who was obviously never really got on board with the whole iPhone thing, like he didn't understand them, he would just sit there and he would just sit for 3 minutes, which doesn't seem like a long time when you really think about it. But that's one of those things that made me realize, oh yeah, like my generation, I'm like older Gen Z, is just so allergic to boredom.
Yeah, someone who's also, I guess, technically I'm scraping at older Gen Z. Yeah, I find it impossible to be bored, in the sense of like every time, it's especially in sort of the marketization of human attention. Someone's like, oh, you might see something that will give you like inspiration, or you'll see a message from somebody that's, it's almost like there's an opportunity cost to one's human capital presented to you in the image that you must keep scrolling and consuming. And I think it's interesting as well, just what you're saying about it, the difficulty of having self-awareness versus having irony. And I think it's particularly difficult in like philosophical writing, because philosophers, at least my training originally as an analytic philosopher, you are well, if the training works, you're meant to be very self-conscious. You're meant to be essentially, every time you write something down, you're trying to explain it to the most quote-unquote clear, so-called terms possible to somebody who essentially is the worst possible audience member. Like trying to explain it to the critic who can always point out that some premise is unsound or contradictory or something. Essentially, you know, training for philosophical writing is in many ways learning how to preempt the worst assholes in human history and then integrate that into your own self-conception of yourself as a writer. And this is quite beneficial in some ways, because it makes you a better writer, sometimes more concerned about whether your writing is true. But then if you want to rebel against that, you can either do that purely in the ironic mode of writing in this purely negative manner, or you can write sincere philosophy in which you can become so sincere you don't even question whether truth is there. It becomes this sort of verbal positing, this verbal almost kind of diarrhea. And it is weird how I do try not to write either, although often fail at that. But I do wonder if there's a third dimension maybe we're missing here, possibly between sort of the pure immediacy of sincerity and the pure immediacy of not being self-aware. I mean, maybe that's me putting out a false dichotomy there. And being ironic, isn't there like an ethical in way to it? So you can be self-conscious about your choices and also sincere about them. And I wonder if that's kind of maybe that is just new sincerity, like how sickeningly sweet the American Office is, which was invented to destroy the nihilistic irony of the British version, which of course means it's superior. Apart from the fact Ricky Gervais is a absolute arsehole. But that aside, I do wonder, is there a sort of way that Wallace wants to talk about navigating this through the ethical? And I am, of course, thinking, and also if listeners like this episode, go back and check out Hannah's appearances on our friends Moral Minorities podcast, because I'm kind of stealing a bit of morality there. But is there an ethical dimension to what Wallace is trying to do here? And is that how he might navigate the dimension of the self versus the fact that we can't really go back to a pre-ironic time necessarily.
Yeah, I definitely think there is like an ethical dimension. And I think that like that's why a lot of Wallace kind of has a reputation of being a bit of a traditionalist or like a conservative, not so much a political conservative, but like an ideological conservative, because he wants some sort of return to like traditional moral values when it comes to the self and how we interact with the world. And I think that's probably best seen in his most accessible thing, which is his 2005 commencement speech, "This is Water." If you are completely new to Wallace, it might be a good place to start. But my dad loves that speech. And he hasn't read much other Wallace, but yeah, that in that speech he talks about sort of how like your mindset can affect how you interact with the world and how you interact with others, and how if you go about your day with the default setting, which is this sense that everyone else in the world that you encounter were placed there specifically to annoy you, you're going to be a worse person and a more miserable person than if you go about the world trying to think about how each of these people has their own complex inner lives and goals and stuff, and that you're just as much of a nuisance to them as they are to you, and you're not essentially the center of the universe just because you're the center of your own universe. And it seems like pretty simple advice, and I think it is pretty simple advice, but it's something that I think about sometimes when I'm at the grocery store. There's and someone is just like blocking the entire aisle. And I always think back to that speech, because it's like, wait a second, that maybe they've had a long day. How many times have I blocked the entire aisle? Probably more than once. And it's kind of this, I think that's sort of where his ethical concern was in the idea of like, how do we as individuals look at the world or approach the world, and how does that reflect not just on how does it manifest in our treatment of others, but also how does it manifest in our own happiness and our own ability to withstand just like the everyday trials of being an adult.
And I think that challenge to do so is complicated by the fact that these days, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or what have you, with respect to you being at the supermarket and the aisle being blocked, depending on who the person is, that could be an opportunity to grab some quick social capital, get your phone out, and have a public crash out. And so it sets a stage. It creates an arena by which somebody could gain a lot and somebody could lose a lot in an instant. And I mean, I know people these days, especially younger people, who have that in mind when they're out in public. Like I'm thinking about people in my family who are about that age, just absolutely cognizant of the fact that everybody has phones, that there could be some sort of encounter by which the phone suddenly comes out. Now, I'm just amazed at my like nieces and nephews' ability to pull out the phone, like quick draw McGraw style, like they were ready to record that event. There's a kind of ethics of opacity, if you will, that I think we would be right to cultivate in our society, where maybe what would it be like if this encounter wasn't publicized, if it was not seen? What sort of virtues would take root? Maybe just to kind of pivot the conversation in a direction that I hope that it can go for a short while is, I think some of these themes are picked up by somebody like Mark Fisher as well. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was, first of all, I want to put forward a provocation. I believe that David Foster Wallace is our Mark Fisher, in the sense that the sort of themes that they approach, the concerns that they have, and even as you said, there's a way of framing both Mark Fisher and David Foster Wallace where they see the excesses and the absolute infiltration of capital into every aspect of our lives, to the extent that we feel like, or they felt like, they want to return, not necessarily to embrace tradition for its own sake, but to get to a place where that incursion of capital into the ordinary is blocked or is dissipated somehow. or transcended even, even thinking of Mark Fisher's Acid Communism. Since we have veritable experts in the room right now between Adam and Emma on the work of Mark Fisher, they've both worked on Mark's work. I'd like to ask all of you, starting with Hannah, what do you think about that comparison?
I think it's an apt comparison. I particularly, I think of the intro to Ghosts of My Life, where he's talking about how we're kind of culturally at the end of history. It's hard to develop from here, and the whole book is devoted to pieces of art, Inception, Joy Division, that sort of harken back to the past in a way, or make some sort of hauntological recall, as opposed to looking forward to the future. You guys can correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, because
You're doing great.
I'm not as much of an expert on Fisher, but I think that Unibus Plurum is sort of hitting a lot of those themes too, because Wallace sort of saw irony as it's a part of us now. How do we get back to something sincere? And he even foresaw the next thing, not as being there's going to be a new type of writing, but no, we're going to go back and we're going to start expressing traditional values again in our work. And so that's sort of almost a hauntological thing too, as they both seemed implicitly or not to agree that the way forward is almost back, or the only way forward is back.
Emma, I'm going to have to ask you, and sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm sure you have at least a little something to say about the comparison.
I do. I want to return to a point that Adam made, actually, in looking for a third way, a way of writing that isn't the analytic style of attempting for perfect rectification with the truth, that's actuarial, that is defensive in a sense because it's attempting to account for all possible criticisms and is attempting something like a completion of the expression of the truth. If that's one side, the other side would be an ironized play of surfaces where the lens is always zooming in and out, but it's never fully lodged directly at the truth, if that makes sense. If these are the two poles that we're trying to triangulate from or find a line of flight from, Wallace and Fischer are good examples for a reason that connects them in terms of their approach to writing. Maybe not so much their self-conscious philosophizing, although a little bit, but it's really more just about the way that they write. So both are very dialed into specifics. Of everything that Fischer wrote about, my favorite work of his is about music. He is so, pardon the pun, in tune with music that he's able to express an experience of music that is really convocational. It doesn't just speak for him, it rings true for people who love the same work that he does. He has an essay about the Roxy Music song, Mother of Pearl, that when I read it for the first time, it blew me away because I didn't know that it was possible to write about art like that, to capture an experience that I thought was really my own. So he seems to be tuning into a wavelength that precedes and exceeds him. And the same thing is true of David Foster Wallace. I actually just for the first time read the essay about the porn industry, Big Red Sun. And I have no doubt that he's fabulating and embellishing, but my God, the attention to detail and so much that you can infer about his inner life. And it's notable that he writes this in the first person plural too, which is rare. He refers to himself as the correspondence. And what I'm getting at here is that they are writing from what we might mistake as a subjective viewpoint. Fischer's experience of listening to Roxy music or The Fall or Brian Eno or reading something, watching a movie, Wallace's experience on a cruise or at this porn convention or what have you, thinking about his nonfiction writing in particular. And they're very much telling us about their inner life as they're describing details that are objectively true of the song or the event. But what I actually think is going on here isn't that they're giving a subjective account, but they're actually speaking to a collective subject because they're bypassing the general. Because in Fischer's writings about culture in particular, he's not in the mode of a philosopher or a theorist. He's really doing cultural criticism, and almost in some cases, it's not criticism in any really academicized sense. So they're able to instantiate a collective subject because they're not being tasked to defend their points with evidence, to move to another level of explanation that is the general. And the thesis that I see being borne out here is Fischer's explicit thesis. And I think what Wallace is really gesturing towards, simply that our experiences don't belong to us. There's no such thing as a true inner life that isn't continuous with outer life. And I think that it's a shame that, if anything, what I see happening today is a further retreat into the subjective, into the private, into the self-conscious that makes their work seem incredibly relevant. But I think the actual message somehow can't take hold when we're being so lodged like deeply in our self-consciousness and deep in the consciousness of others. I think we're forgetting that what they were really telling us is that by telling your own story, so to speak, it's not auto theory. It's not going infinitely into your own mind, that every single one of us is a bearer of other people. And maybe I'm putting too much on them. I'm sort of fangirling out about both right now. But that's why it was really exciting for me to actually have an opportunity to go back to Wallace's work as a Fischer reader, because I hadn't read David Foster Wallace in forever. And since then, I've gone to grad school and had all these new thoughts and saw all these new implications.
I mean, I really don't have as much of experience with David Foster Wallace to make the comparison in too strong a way. I think Emma and Hannah, you've already covered it wonderfully. But at least from this essay, I can't help but think about capitalist realism, the section where he's talking about media consumption, and I think in many ways Fischer himself, very much and openly so, a social media addict who had to eventually sort of come off of it, which is just a modern subjectivity these days. He does, through a kind of total immersion in the dominant media of his time, looks back to reclaim what he would call popular modernism, to try and find something, for God's sake. It didn't have to go this fucking way for once. It didn't have to go this way. It didn't have these highest values that may have devalued themselves, didn't have to be devalued in the way there was, for example, living in the aftermath of Thatcher and Reagan. And I think rather than just it's very to make it's on the surface level, these guys are pretty much intersecting apart from the accents. Because if you read like essay like E Unibus Plurum, man yells at kids on their damn TV versus man yells at those kids on their damn phones. Like, fair enough. But I do think both the attention to detail, as Emma said, and I would say even kind of the pining, the yearning in a miserable malaise in which everyone can connect to. Because one of the things I think that Wallace picks up on in the essay in particular is that when he talks about where we are happy when we're watching TV, for example, but we're not always happy about the fact that we're watching this much TV. And I think Fischer's own reflections, for example, on his engagements with the internet and these kind of utopian critical imaginaries he had with the internet, particularly around his PhD thesis, Flatline Constructs, really comes into this idea of, okay, we're now captured in this medium that previously fascinated us. And there's something in which we find ourselves unable to seek anything else but the pleasure of consuming it, even though for our strategies of irony and our strategies of self-deprecation in many ways, we're not able to truly escape it, or at least not on our own. To which I have to ask, what would David Foster Wallace think of the medium of podcasting? Because it's. I mean, would he have an essay and people listening to them at double or 3 times the speed? Because turns out that some people do, which is, I guess, fair enough. But it is interesting how prescient it is, insofar as what he's talking about is not simply a technological aspect. He's not simply talking about these boxes, because he says, as Wallace says in the essay, this is just furniture. It's about kind of the general, there is the cusp of, sort of grasping the social relations of consumption generally. And I think he's a really good access point to starting to really think about that stuff seriously, in the same way that Fischer was for many people with books like Ghost of My Life and Capitalist Realism.
There's so much that I could respond to, but I think the idea of like the internal versus the external and how are we mediating these things? I mean, I think I read, I wish I had like the source on hand, but this is not my quote, but it's one I agree with. Is David Foster Wallace's essays are not about like what it's like to go on a cruise or what it's like to go to a porn convention. They're about what it's like to be David Foster Wallace. And I think in my case, at least, being David Foster Wallace is very similar to being Hannah Smart. So it really, it allows me to sort of impose like, what would it feel like if I were on a cruise? I guess I would hate it. Like, I guess I would be, I would also be thinking about how the people who are making my bed every 5 minutes are being underpaid or whatever. Like, it's so like, and I think that's kind of why Wallace is so polarizing, or one of the reasons why, because if you have a similar thought process to him, it feels so magical to sort of the immersiveness and the feeling that your own stream of consciousness is being expressed more eloquently than you could express it yourself is like so magical. But if you're not like that, it's probably hard to sort of like, you want to be told what it's like to be on a cruise. You don't care how this dude feels about the cruise. And so I don't think he's for everyone. And I mean, I think everyone should try him because he is for a lot of people. But I think that the feeling that like, if you don't feel like you can put yourself into that headspace, then, it's not gonna work for you.
Maybe the last thing that we'll tackle in this discussion is the very first thing that we brought up in the introduction, the concept of performativity. And maybe we could call this David Foster Wallace 2049, in the wake of his coming to pass, but his legacy still haunting us. I would like to think about what it means to live in a context where we have democratized the creation of the imago that now traps us. And I was curious, amidst the acceleration of, or the intensification of our communicative apparatus, our technological apparatus, and looking at today's social context and smartphones and everything else besides, clearly both David Foster Wallace and Mark Fisher would have a field day. But is there a way to escape the irony and the boredom yet again? I want to slide back to one more thing, and maybe we can kind of throw this in the little bundle here at the end. When Hannah, when you were talking about going back to boredom, or maybe finding a space in our lives where we could create this sort of vacuole of non-activity or boredom, where we don't immediately reach for the phone, we resist the impulse to get online again. There have been instances in my life living here in rural America where I've put my phone down for 1 or 2 hours and I'm outside in the yard shoveling some loose dirt into a hole in my yard or pulling out a tree stump or something like that. And I'll catch myself in the act of saying something like, this is the boredom that I was trying to achieve. But in that moment of self-awareness, what stands behind that insight is the specter of social capital, the specter of the machine. The relief that I feel amidst that boredom is in a dialectical relationship, so to speak, with the fact that I am going back to the phone at some point, right? And so it's hard not to have that meta thought and hard to inhabit a sense of true or new sincerity. And amidst those comments and considering what David Foster Wallace has said and written, do you have any insights as to how we as a culture can undergo an autonomously driven therapy of sorts to achieve a new kind of sincerity?
Yeah, I think the answer is sort of in The Pale King, and I think that's what he was trying to figure out in The Pale King. I'm not sure if he ever figured it out, but something that he did diagnose was this idea that like there must be a reason that people are so allergic to boredom, because what boredom really is being alone with your own thoughts. And what is it about our own thoughts in modern day America, but probably a lot of other countries as well, that we find so repulsive and so worth fleeing from? Why would I rather read other people's really dumb thoughts on Twitter than listen to my own original thoughts in my head? And his diagnosis, which was maybe a little bit of projection on his part, was that we're running from some sort of psychic pain and or some sort of anticipation of psychic pain. And I think his solution was, in a way, allowing ourselves to feel that psychic pain so that we can learn that it's not as painful as we think it is, or so that we can sort of become more acquainted with whatever it is in our heads that we don't want to confront. And maybe that's not the case for everyone, but it certainly rang true for me. And yeah, I mean, I run a lot. I run like 30 miles a week, and that's kind of my time where I confront it, because it's like you can't run and be on your phone unless you want to be bumping into stuff and people. So I have 45 minutes a day where I'm just not on my phone and I can think, and that's really therapeutic. I think just finding opportunities, like you said, with the shoveling to be away from it. And I also think the performativity thing, the idea that Infinite Jest is only pretended to be read by performative males. I mean, I've been accused of only pretending to read the book to impress a guy in my MFA. There's no guy in my MFA I'm trying to impress. I'm married to a guy I've known since the 8th grade. But I think there is sort of this, it's hard to know what to say to those people. Like, no, I'm not pretending. My personality is not fake. I'm not reading a 1,000-page book to be cool. Like, if I wanted to be cool, I'd do something different from that. And I think there is also this, like, there is an undercurrent of sexism about it, because there's this implicit sense that like big literary stuff is for men and women should just stick to their book talk romances or whatever, which isn't like an implication I enjoy. But yeah.
40-page poetry chapbook versus the hulking Infinite Jest. Well, maybe we'll just do some final thoughts, go from Emma to Adam, and then we'll wrap up with you, Hannah. Emma, anything you want to close out with?
Maybe the idea is not that the pain of your own thoughts isn't painful, but that the pain won't kill you. There's this connection to be drawn between being alone with your own thoughts and the vertigo and nausea of it, and Wallace's writings about entertaining ourselves to death. That's the title of somebody else's book. And also a connection to be drawn there with Mark Fisher and depressive anhedonia. Pain is good, because if you walk through the door of pain, something interesting happens on the other side. But the other thing that I wanted to say about that was that it's going to sound mystical, but I believe that our thoughts, not even our own, and maybe the source of the pain, is that we are so entrenched in this identification with a self, a reified self, and it's the unreality of that construct that's making us feel bad. When we start to identify our thoughts as belonging only to ourselves, and then let's say it's late at night and you've done the consciousness hygiene thing of not having your phone anywhere near your bed, and you're just thinking your own thinky thoughts, trying to fall asleep, and you feel alone. The thinking of that is only your experience is what's actually causing you pain. So that's a very sort of woo philosophy note for me to end on. And I guess the only other thing I have to say is just, it's been wonderful to hear your perspectives, Hannah. Just really laying down a lot of things that have already sparked a lot of new thoughts for me about David Foster Wallace. So just really grateful.
Thank you. And same to you.
I mean, I really hate being alone with my thoughts. That's what the phone's for. Like, if I have a good one, I'm like, oh, you got to share that. Yeah, that becomes a banger. I understand wholly that is a symptom of the very thing. I read people like David Foster Wallace and Mark Fischer too, and plenty of other people as well, to sort of get on top of. Partially, I think sometimes the pain of thoughts is also the idea that I think that Fischer picks up on as well, is the idea of other possibilities. Sometimes, if you don't feel good about, say, your consumption of TV, to use Wallace's dichotomy, you might still keep consuming it because then it will distract you from not feeling good about the ways in which you feel good generally. And I think that is quite a good dichotomy to put in. I mean, the performative memification stuff, I mean, it's not performative. If someone does that, you have to say to them, just fuck off, really. I mean, and it's usually someone who's never read a book or at least disdains the idea. But no, yeah, I think it was a really fun conversation. It's really good, I think, for me to be introduced to David Foster Wallace and getting more beyond the memification, the image that you get in pop culture. See behind the bandana, so to speak. And yeah, Hannah, thanks so much for joining us.
I'll just say one thing before I give it back to you, Hannah. I began this year doing the various audiobooks of David Foster Wallace's essays. And just simply put, he inspired me to start writing again. Because just to see somebody with that level of sensitivity to the world and his very unique and nuanced way of articulating his perspective, I was envious. And it was the kind of envy that spurred me on to like, well, what can I do? In the Nietzschean sense, it was the kind of envy that brought out the best in me. And I'm still pursuing that. And so I'm thankful for his work. And I would simply recommend that you get the volume that includes, if you want to do the audiobook, that is, which particular book is E Unibus Plurum in the supposedly fun thing what is that, Hannah?
A supposedly fun thing I'll never do again.
That's right. Yeah, supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. And then, of course, I think there's like a collected works of David Foster Wallace as well. Big Red Sun is definitely an essay everybody should do. If I had to recommend two, it would be those. And maybe Hannah can recommend a couple more if you're just getting started. But with that, Hannah, please give us your recommendation. And after you do, let us know what you're getting onto next.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about Wallace, if you couldn't tell. As for her, I had the same exact experience as you with just being so jealous and making me want to write more. I've been writing since I was a kid, but I think like through all the bad Infinite Jest imitations that I produced in 2018, I think I eventually became a better writer. And I think I'm still chasing that. I want to be as good as him, even though that's impossible, but it's such a strong motivator. I was published in a magazine he was published in, and I looked up how old he was when he appeared in there, and I was like a year younger than he was, and I was like, I got. So he really is my greatest foe as well as my greatest inspiration. But I would say a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. The last essay in that, the cruise essay, you've got to read the unabridged 100-page version. It's simply hilarious. It is one that I recommend to everyone because I think it is pretty accessible as well. I think from Consider the Lobster, Big Red Sun, like you said, I think also the John McCain essay goes really well with Plurum. Again, read the Consider the Lobster version, not the abridged online version. Wallace was quite irked because the online version cut a lot of what was kind of critical toward McCain. And made it sound like he was pro McCain. And there's like this whole intro in the Consider the Lobster essay where he clarifies that he's not pro McCain. He says, I'm not anti or pro. I'm just observing what I see, and some of it's good and some of it's bad is sort of how you put it. But yeah, like, so I think that one is great and also hilarious. I think the State Fair essay and supposedly fun thing is really good. Also very embellished, but I think his embellishments make it more entertaining, so I can forgive that. But those would be my recommendations for essays. For short stories, I often recommend Forever Overhead, which is available online, and Good Old Neon, which is also available online. If you just Google the titles, you'll find them quite easily. So yeah.
Cool. And how about you? What's on the horizon for Hannah?
Yeah, so I've got my book coming out, which is I'm excited for that. I have not had a book come out before, so it's going to be a new experience. Next week, I think I have a short story appearing in X-Ray magazine, and I also pretty soon will have a review of William Gass's The Tunnel coming out in Cleveland Review of Books. So yeah, and then the Emergency Zine in June, like I said. I don't have a pre-order link for that yet, but it should be up on my website like within the next month. So yeah.
Cool. Well, just send all the links you'd like. We'll slap them in the show notes, and folks can really enjoy your writing alongside all of the David Foster Wallace recommendations. Hannah, it was great having you.
It was great being here.